Good morning, church. This is something different. We have done this before in the past. This is about getting to know members of our family and their story. Sometimes we sit here and think, are we the only people who've done this or experienced that and that? And sometimes it's good to hear that you're not alone. And things that you've experienced, not necessarily you're the only person who's experienced it. So, with me I have John Garratt. If I dare say, one of the originals. Been with the church for a long time. So I'm going to interview John. Yes, let's get into it.
Morning, Liam.
Morning, John. So, John, when and where were you born?
Which birth are you talking about? My physical birth or my birth into Christ?
Your biological birth.
Right. I was born in 1946 in a very beautiful part of the world in Shropshire called Shrewsbury.
Okay, excellent. Pleasure. Shrewsbury's in the UK, England.
Claro.
Where did you grow up and go to school?
Again in Shropshire, a small town called Market Drayton, which was in the northeast corner of Shropshire on the border with Staffordshire and Cheshire. And I went to two schools there. Three schools there, yes. The infant school, which was a very modern school in those days, new buildings, delightful teachers, and we all had little duties that we had to perform. One was to clean out the fish tank once a week until it got broken, which I got the cane for. But generally speaking, and then on to junior school, which was in an old school until halfway through my term there. We moved to a very old house which had been purchased by the Education Authority, which was then going to be turned into, later on in the years, into a comprehensive school. And then from there I went to Market Drayton County Grammar School, where I served my time. I say that because it was like serving time, but it was one of those old-fashioned grammar schools where the masters wore capes and the old flat hat, and I remember my first week there, along with others, we were interviewed, if you like, as a class like now, where the assistant headmaster stepped up to his desk, which was one of those big desks which he stood onto, and he goes, "My name is Bruiser, and I'm proud of my name." In fact, I don't think he ever used any physical chastisement in all the years that I was there, but just to be called Bruiser was sufficient to put us in our guard. In fact, many years later I became a paper boy, and I used to take my papers to his house, and he was very generous at Christmas. So that's my experience of school there.
Excellent. And what did you study in your tertiary education?
Well, I actually left school and went into the army as a boy, where I studied the necessary essentials which you have to there. But in addition to that, they make you go through different GCE, which is what now GCE, O levels, as it was in those days. And but it gave me a taste in the army for structural engineering. I come from a family of builders anyway, and in fact I married into a family of builders as well, so it's surprising that my life has been in civil and structural engineering, and I studied civil and structural engineering at what is now Stafford University. It wasn't then, it was, they were all called technical colleges in those days. They became universities later, but I studied there and got my appropriate awards, shall I say. Yeah.
Talking about being married into, let's get personal.
This is where my wife is not very happy.
No. When and how did you meet Jan?
We disagreed about this. She says we actually met at a school dance. But yes, it was a school dance. It was in what was then the comprehensive, in their big hall. They used to have dances every so and then, and that is really where I got to first meet Jan properly. So, and after that it was his history.
I'm sure most of us will have a disagreement amongst husband and wife as to when we met and what the first date was and that.
Well, I say it was, you see, we were both members of a Young Communicants Guild there because we used to go to the same church, and this was an offshoot of that. It was like the youth club of the church, Young Communicants Guild, and Jan used to go to it and I used to go to it, but I must admit in those days I wasn't particularly interested. Yeah. Well, not overtly anyway.
Okay, well, so when did you marry Jan?
1969.
Wow, okay.
A long time ago. Yeah.
Now, this is the one I'm quite interested in, which I quite like, puts a bit of interest in somebody's life, is, have you had any experiences in your life that have had a lasting impact on you?
I had to think long and hard about this because I know we need to put it down to time. But I tried to put it into 3 or 4 different categories. The first one was obviously my marriage, which has now been ongoing now for 50 odd years. So for that, I really do have to thank Jan for putting up with me for that period of time. We had our ups and downs, of course. In fact, generally it was due to I had an addiction to rallying. Everything that I did went on the car. Every bit of money that I earned went on the car because everything had to be the best for the car because I was going to put it through all different circumstances that you put a rally car through. And but in fact, it was almost my downfall, and it was because of Jan saying to me one day, said, "You've got to make a choice here, either me or the car." Well, it was brought about also the fact that the bank manager had come to me and said, "I'm no longer supporting you. You've got to pay your own way." Well, we didn't have anything. I'd spent all the money, literally all the money on the car. I had 3 jobs and I was putting all the money in. I stopped paying the mortgage and everything. And I was really a bad lad. But, you know, even in those days, you realise, looking back, how God had his hand on you. I didn't realise it at the time. But as a result, I decided that I would go and earn the money to pay off all the debts. And I went and worked overseas. And the first year was in Saudi Arabia. And I say first year, I actually worked there on and off for 4 years. And then I ended up in Iran as one of the Ayatollah Khamenei's throwouts, along with about 3,000 or 4,000 other expat engineers. And that had its mark on my life because we went through seeing how different aspects of people's lives are very seriously affected by where they grow up. And I think that really made me appreciate the difference of living and working in a third world, having come from a first world, because I would see the squalor on one side and I would see the wealth on the other side. And literally they separated themselves by high walls. And the way also that the sexes treated each other is that the men really, in my opinion, abused the women terribly. It didn't matter from what walk of life they came from, the women were always downtrodden and were always, as Jan would say, walk 6 paces behind, which he learned to do later on in life. But no, seriously, it's only because I walk faster than she does. But the thing is that it really put a mark on my life as to the differences that we have coming up and growing up in the West. And then you go to the Middle East, or as I did later on, to Africa, to Nigeria, and then down to South America in Bolivia, is that there is a huge difference. And you go to countries that consider themselves first world, and even when we go to the States now to see our family, they consider themselves first world. But you know, there's a big, big divide in that country. And I think Beatrice would agree with me.
Amen.
There's the haves and the have-nots, and there is a big divide between the two. And the thing is, they don't seem to be getting any closer together. If anything, they seem to be going further and further apart.
That's right.
One of the trips that I had was to Bolivia. Jan and I went to visit our daughter who was doing a Year for God with a street project in Bolivia. And we visited there. And again, straight in, I knew I'd worked in Bolivia previously, so I did know a bit about what to expect. But our daughter didn't, and I used to tell her some of the stories that I embraced during my working time in Bolivia, especially of taking chicken soup. Is that you see it and it arrives on a plate with claws sticking out of the soup, which, believe it or not, are a favourite food in Bolivia and a lot of African countries as well, is they love the claws. Why, I don't know, but anyway, they do. But we had this one particular night, we were out on the streets with the team, and we were walking, looking for the street kids. And it was very, very quiet, and it was just after they'd had a carnival period when the police do a roundup of all the street kids and get rid of them. They palm them off prison wherever they can. And we were just going around after this, and the street kids were starting to be re-released. And we were walking down between some garages or some containers, I forget quite what. And all of a sudden these kids appeared, and they ran to us. And we wondered why. Yes, okay, we're going to give you food, we're going to attend to your current needs, but why are you suddenly flocking round to us and hanging on to our legs? We looked down the other end of the street, and there was the police. And the police were carrying pickaxes, handles, and all sorts of things. And it was explained to us that if we hadn't have been there, the police would have beaten those kids. And so they clung to us, being Europeans, because we were respected, with a little r, I might add, by the police. We had rights, the kids didn't. We had a British passport. The kids were just nobody. And it really impacted our lives as to a lot. And we still support the project out there. That was back in 1992. And they're still doing amazing things. And that project is still going. And it never ceases to amaze. In fact, one of the UK supporters of the mission just completed the London Marathon and raised £15,000 towards the mission. So, you know, it's still really going. It's hard work. They're very much affected by the dollar, or the value of the dollar against the Bolivianos. And it really, every time there's an increase in the dollar or a spike in the dollar, it affects the Bolivianos. And so the cost of living rises and the income goes down, and they're always struggling. And they're always, can I say, requesting support from the likes of ourselves. So those really, I think, are the main things that have impacted my life. Yeah.
Yeah, as somebody who comes from Africa, grew up in Africa, yeah, you experience the divide between those who have and those who have not. Besides the choice Jane gave you, when did you choose to become a Christian, and how?
Well, it's not a very easy scenario. Back in the 80s, we were doing very, very well business-wise. I had a partnership with another guy, and we were doing project management of the erection of power stations in Nigeria. And it was really providing us with cash, a lot of cash. And so we lived in Hampshire at the time, in Ringwood, and it was our desire that we would like to go and live in the New Forest. And so, yes, we got the surplus cash, we could go and do it. So we did. And of course, remember, I wasn't a Christian then, and so we didn't ask God. We just did it. And the thing is, it became very, very difficult. As well as having surplus cash for the deposit, we needed a second mortgage, and which meant we needed to sell the first house. And it wasn't selling. It was just not selling. And one day it got to desperation states. And I was up in the bedroom and I got on my knees and I said, if there's a God, if you sell my house, I will worship you. Guess what? 3 days later, the house sold. Not without problems, but it sold and it concluded. And so I ended up fulfilling my part of the deal and gave my life to God. And I'm not suggesting to everybody you should throw fleeces down before God, but it certainly worked. And here I am today.
Yeah, for those who are not sure about God, you know, He exists, and if you do make it such a bargain with Him, don't be surprised if He answers you and He expects you to hold up your end of that bargain.
That was in 1984, May 1984.
What style of churches did you attend in the UK?
Well, our original upbringing was in Anglican church, and so we're quite sort of still almost written into the Anglican way and services and things like that. And when we first became Christians, because Jan became a Christian not long after me, due to continuous hammering of her. But anyway, we were living in the New Forest then, and it was a little small country parish of which was built up of 5 little hamlets. And we went and joined there, and the vicar there was a born-again believer. And so it was really great because we could have a fellowship with him. And in fact, we found there were 5 other believers as well in the village. So we had a great time. But then there was a time when I think God decided that he wanted to move us. So the business absolutely went through the floor, and we ended up with nothing. We had to sell the house, and we sort of said, well, where do we go, Lord? Having put the last £5 note on the plate, you know, we really then did depend on God. But you know what? He never failed us at any time. Amen. Every bill that came through the door, he met from one source or another. From wherever, I can't remember them all apart from one tax refund which I didn't expect. And that tax refund exactly met one of the bills that was coming out. But, so from there, when God moved us, we went up into Gloucestershire and we said, we are going to find a church that suits us. How many people have said that? But anyway, I was working on a job of the refurbishment of the old Severn Bridge. And through that job, I met a guy who was a leader of a free church in Minchinhampton in Gloucestershire, up in the Cotswolds. And as a result, we ended up going to him. And he and his wife almost became surrogate parents to us, and certainly in the Lord they did. And we stayed there for
17 years.
Sorry?
17 years.
17 years. And we ended up pastoring it. So that's how things went on. But we had to close that church because it dropped down and down and down. And in those days, I don't think we quite had the same sort of, say, trust in God is perhaps not quite right, but trust in ourselves to be trustworthy to God. And so when we got down to about 10 of us, we closed it because we thought there was no way it was going to succeed. And that's probably one of the regrets of my life, is that we didn't hang in there and see what God would have done. But anyway, as a result of that, we then stayed free church. We moved to North Devon, where we joined another free church, which ended up unfortunately folding due to the fact that the pastor's wife died, and as a result he really did have a tough time, and I won't say went off the rails, but I think he fell from grace and closed the church. And then we tried to resurrect it out of it, but it just didn't work. The right people, they weren't God-appointed people. And so from there we moved into the free church in Barnstaple, which was part of a very big Australian movement, of which there were 2,000 churches worldwide. But it was very much the mega church sort of situation, and not quite right, not quite right. We like a small church where we're all family together. Yep. And we can go and share with one another, we can call each other, we can really get to be with one another and become part of the family of God, rather than just somebody on the outskirts. And that's something we recognise in our daughter's church in the States, is that when we go and visit there, we just feel part of a meeting congregation, because all their work outside the weekly meeting in church is done in little groups outside. But anyway, going on from there, we were still went to North Devon, and we then joined a Baptist church, which was more like we are today. And I think that we are more Pentecostal than anything else. We call ourselves a free church, but I think we're really steeped in Pentecostal beliefs and the way we operate here. So that really is my experience of church. Yeah.
The reason why I asked that question is because you all know that the family of Living Water Church, we are made up of different people from different countries and obviously different styles of church. So yeah, it's always good that it's not one church fits all. It's a style, where God leads you and where you need to be rooted. But coming back to Living Water Church, when and how did you get to come to Spain?
Can I do the why first?
Okay, why?
1989, I had a dream. Famous words, aren't they? I had a dream. But I had a dream, and in this dream, it said, or it showed, that we were going to go to Spain to help other churches, that we'd get a camper and we would help go around different churches helping. That didn't materialise until we bought a house in 2000 in Spain. We first came to Spain on holiday in 1999, when we as a couple decided that we'd like to come and live here. And so in 2000 we came and we bought a place up near Aguilas, and we shared that place with a couple of friends who were not Christians, but we then shared that, and the idea is that this was our nest egg for our pension. Obviously I wasn't pension age then, but rapidly approaching. So we agreed that when we reached pension age is that we would sell it and see where things went. And so we would come. I was then working self-employed for different organisations, particularly linked to the railway. And because I was self-employed, I could take long holidays. And we started taking 3-month holidays, and we would come here for 3 months, back to the UK for 3 months, back here for 3 months. And so we did that for many years. And during that period, we visited 2 or 3 different churches. I think our first experience was with Oasis, which was the instigator of this church back in 2000, when we met down the Playa. And from there, because of the distance that we were travelling from near Aguilas to Majaca, we sought somewhere closer. And there was the Christian Centre at Bougainvilliers, not much closer, but we went there, and we met quite a few people there who became part of this church, and Touré Church. And we were told eventually that, no, we mustn't meet there. Chris Smith and his wife, Chris Smith, who ran it, didn't want it to become a church. They wanted it just to be an R&R place for pastors and ministers who could go and then have a meeting on a Sunday, but have a rest for the rest of the time. And so from there, we got to know Dave and Pam, and we started going with them to Touré, and also then when they left Touré, we went with them to an African church, and then eventually came to the Bergen del Mar, which was meeting in the restaurant up there, and that was the first period of when it was called Living Water Church, which was about 2008. So that was how we came here, the vision or the dream to coming and living here and spending more time here, and then even more time. And then we finally decided that we really wanted to move here permanently. So in 2014 we came, and we came lock, stock and barrel into Spain. we sold our house near Aguilas in 2016 and moved closer to here. And for the first 18 months we lived up in Cabrera in the rental place, because having sold the place near Aguilas, we said we don't want to go through that again, so we won't ever buy another place in Spain. Don't ever say never to God. But as a result is that we spent 18 months in Cabrera, and a lot of you wouldn't come up to visit us because of going up the mountain. Load of wusses, they all were everywhere. The road wasn't that bad, there was only one or two places where it was into fresh air. But the thing is that we decided that if people won't come to us, we need to get closer to people. Because at that time, we were doing co-pastoring with Dave and Pam. And so for the 6 months that we spent here, is that we needed to see people, people needed to visit us. And it wasn't happening. They wouldn't come. So we decided we would move closer. So we rented, in fact, the place we now own in Palomares. And that in itself was a bit of a story, because a year last Christmas, I was taken ill in the US. And just before we left that, is that the landlord turned around and said he wanted to sell. So we said to our agent, well, we don't want to buy it, we'll look for somewhere else to rent. Anyway, I was ill, which then really took its toll on me at the time. And when we came back, I woke up that first morning, the sun shining through the window, the sea in the distance, and the tranquility. And I thought, I don't want to move. I went down to breakfast that morning, and I said to Jan, you're not going to like what I'm going to say. I don't want to move. I think we ought to buy this place. And Jan says, I've been thinking the same thing. So God had been speaking to both of us, and so that's why where we are today, and which we're now doing. During that period, we used to think, if we own this place, we could do this, we could do that. Well, guess what? Now we've owned it, we've done this, we've done that, and we're doing that. So, you know, God is good all the time.
You kind of touched on how you came to be at LWC.
Well, LWC, yeah, basically getting to know Dave and Pam in more depth, is that realised that they needed support, and so we became part of what was then Fellowship of the Kings. And I remember being interviewed by Leslie Thomas at the time, and he came after David mooted to the leadership and to the oversight then, is that I really think John and Jan ought to come and join us as part of the leadership team and co-pastor. And Leslie came up to me and he said, and what's your vision for the church? Well, that hit me like a stone wall, because I hadn't even thought about that. But anyway, I said, really just to support Dave and Pam. Anyway, later on is that we used to have meetings at Julie and Robin's house, thank you. Yeah. I'm talking too much. And at one of those meetings is that there was Donna. Do you remember Donna? She had a vision of this area. And funnily enough, it was the same vision that I'd had some years previous about what this church was about, which was ministering to this area, basically to those that don't yet know Jesus, but also providing a service to those that do, who visit. Now, the best way I can describe this vision that we both had, because they concurred, was that this area would spread the gospel around Spain. Now, the vision that I had was, for some of those who may remember, a program on the TV called Bonanza. Now, always, yes, that's right, Mike. Always, at the start of the program was this flaming of the ranch Bonanza itself. It was all in flame, and that's exactly how I saw the church here, being all in this flame and spreading out as it went across the screen. And that tied in with what Donna had got about the church here spreading out into Spain. And I see one of the few questions is do I see as a future for LWC? And it's precisely that, spreading out into Spain, doing what we do now, not altering that format, in the sense that we are still a light in the darkness here for people who come on holiday. We used to consider ourselves to be like motorway services. People would come in, they would get blessed, and they would go back out again refreshed. And we know that has worked over the years because people visit us time and time and time again and say, do you remember last time I came and you prayed for me? So and so happened. So we know it works, and I still see that happening. And but I do see this vision of this bonanza, Ponderosa on flame, spreading out from here. I still have that vision for this church, being part of that. Not being necessarily the sole instigator of it, but part of it. And I think already see part of that being fulfilled is that occasionally we get Spanish visitors. And when we had our 25th anniversary, there was a couple came from we were then from Torre Church, where we had a joint meeting back in 2017. And she and her husband were there. And as a result of that meeting in 2017, her husband came to the Lord from what was preached there by the visiting speaker. They came here and they explained to us about the way that the Spanish church in little groups is going on and spreading in this area. Well, going back to the original vision of that Kingfisher had, sorry, not Kingfisher, but Fellowship King had, was that in those days there was about 12 sort of satellite churches spread around this part of Almeria. And one of the visions that the lady had there is that those churches would become bigger and they would spread. So that, in its way, added to the vision that we had that this church would become part of. And so I see that still being, and I see it being fulfilled at this moment because we're growing here. And it's not necessarily through new born-again believers, but it's a case of people are coming here. The community, which we never were, has started to materialise. People are now coming here and saying, God's brought me here, I want to live here. And we're seeing it in quite a few cases. And so, we're seeing the vision being fulfilled already, which is absolutely amazing. God never lets us down, does he?
Thank you, John. Well, that's the end of the interview. Afterwards, if you want to ask John more questions than that,
write them on a card and post
them. Questions on a postcard. Thank you very much, John, for agreeing to this interview and that, and giving us an insight into your life and what's all gone.